I never thought I would say this. To anyone who has experienced betrayal, you know how surreal it feels when everything you thought you knew comes crashing down. My name is Mark, and for a long time, I thought I had it all, a loving wife, a comfortable home, and 2 incredible daughters. But life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. It all started about 12 years ago when I met Sarah in college. She was the kind of woman who lit up the room, charming everyone with her laugh and sharp wit. I fell for her hard and fast, and luckily, she felt the same way. We got married a couple of years after graduation, settled in Austin, and eventually welcomed our daughters, Emily and Katie, into the world. I built my career in IT, while Sarah pursued her dream of becoming an event planner. For a while, it was picture perfect, at least, I thought so. Looking back now, I realized there were subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. Sarah started working longer hours, often coming home exhausted and distracted. She'd excuse herself to take calls in another room, claiming they were work emergencies. At first, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her completely. But there were moments, a quick glance at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking or a little too much effort in her appearance on certain mornings, that made me pause. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, Sarah was my wife, my best friend. What could she possibly have to hide? Turns out, a lot. They say intuition is a powerful thing, and I'll admit, mine had been nagging at me for weeks before everything came to light. It started with small things, little inconsistencies that I tried to rationalize. Sarah's phone became practically glued to her hand, even when we were at home together. She'd take it with her everywhere, into the bathroom, out to the backyard, even when she was cooking dinner. If I ever asked her about it, she'd laugh it off, saying, "Everyone's addicted to their phones these days, Mark. Don't overthink it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the phone, it was her mood. She seemed more distant, almost like she was physically present but mentally somewhere else. She wasn't as engaged with the girls, and conversations between us felt strained, like she was holding back. I told myself it was just stress from her job, but deep down, a part of me wondered if there was more to it. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday, just an ordinary midweek evening. Sarah was upstairs putting Katie to bed while I was cleaning up after dinner. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and out of sheer habit, I glanced at the screen. What I saw made my stomach drop. The message was from someone named Dan, and it read, "I can't stop thinking about last weekend. You're incredible." For a moment, I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just read. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was work-related. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. My hands were trembling as I picked up her phone. The screen was still unlocked, and I hesitated, battling with the voice in my head that told me I shouldn't invade her privacy. But I couldn't ignore what I'd just seen. I opened the thread with Dan, and my worst fears were confirmed. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were explicit. They detailed plans they'd made, moments they'd shared, and feelings that went far beyond anything platonic. My chest tightened as I scrolled through weeks' worth of texts, each one a dagger to my heart. There were pictures too, selfies of her smiling in ways I hadn't seen in years, candid shots of places I didn't recognize. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The woman I'd built my life with, the mother of my children, had been sharing parts of herself with someone else. The betrayal hit me like a freight train, and all I could do was stand there, gripping the counter for support. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the screen, before I heard her footsteps coming down the stairs. My mind raced as I shoved her phone back onto the counter, screen down, and tried to compose myself. Sarah walked into the kitchen, smiling softly. "Katie's finally asleep," she said, pouring herself a glass of water. I couldn't even look at her. My hands were clenched into fists at my sides, and my pulse was pounding in my ears. I knew I had to say something, but I wasn't ready, not yet. So I did nothing. I stayed silent, carrying the weight of what I'd just discovered alone, at least for that night. But that night was the beginning of the end. I knew I couldn't unsay what I had seen, and I knew I couldn't ignore it for long. Sarah had betrayed me, and though I didn't know how, I would soon confront her about it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the texts replayed in my mind like a cruel, never-ending loop. By morning, I was running on nothing but adrenaline and anger. I wanted answers, but I also dreaded what I might hear. Part of me clung to the hope that there was some explanation that could make it all go away. Another part of me knew better. That Saturday morning, I decided I couldn't keep it in any longer. The girls were in the living room watching cartoons, and Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, sipping coffee. She looked so normal, so calm, like everything was fine. I felt a wave of resentment. How could she act like nothing was wrong when she was hiding something so massive? I walked in and sat across from her. She glanced up from her laptop, eyebrows raised. "What's up?" she asked, her tone light and casual. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "Who's Dan?" I finally said, my tone sharper than I intended. The effect was immediate. Her face froze, and her hand tightened around her coffee mug. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice too controlled, too careful. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw the texts." "I know." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Her face went pale, and she stared at me like she was trying to gauge how much I actually knew. Then she let out a long sigh, setting her mug down. "Okay," she said quietly. "You're right. I've been seeing someone." The calmness of her confession was like a slap in the face. She didn't deny it, didn't try to explain it away. She just admitted it, as if it were a minor mistake instead of a betrayal that had just shattered our marriage. "How long?" I asked, my voice shaking. "About 6 months," she said, her eyes darting to the floor. 6 months. Half a year of lying, sneaking around, and pretending everything was fine. My hands were trembling, and I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me. "Why, Sarah? Why would you do this? Was I not enough for you?" "It's not like that," she said quickly, finally looking up at me. "It's not about you, Mark. It's about me. I've been feeling lost, I guess. Stressed. Dan was just someone to talk to, someone who understood." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone who understood. Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds? You had me, Sarah. You had our family. And you threw it all away for some guy who sends you dirty texts. She winced at my words but didn't deny them. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said softly. "It just happened. It just happened." I repeated, my voice rising. "You don't just happen into an affair, Sarah. You made a choice. Every text, every meeting, every lie, you made a choice." At this point, my voice had gotten loud enough that the girls poked their heads into the kitchen, curious about the commotion. I forced myself to lower my tone, not wanting to drag them into the mess that was unfolding. "We're not done with this," I said through gritted teeth. "But I'm not doing this in front of the kids." Sarah nodded, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the texts, the lies, and the way she had smiled at me over breakfast just days ago, as if everything was normal. As I walked away, I knew this was only the beginning of what would be one of the hardest chapters of my life. After the confrontation, I felt like I was living in a fog. My emotions swung wildly. One moment, I was seething with rage, and the next, I was consumed by sadness so deep it felt like drowning. I couldn't make sense of it all. How could the woman I'd loved for over a decade betray me like this? I'd built my entire life around Sarah and our family, and now it felt like the foundation of everything was crumbling beneath me. The hardest part was pretending everything was okay for the girls. Emily and Katie were too young to understand what was going on, and I didn't want to burden them with the weight of it all. So I plastered on a smile, helped them with their homework, and read them bedtime stories like I always did. But the moment they were asleep, the mask would come off, and I'd find myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at nothing and replaying every moment of my marriage in my head, searching for the warning signs I'd missed. The nights were the worst. Lying in bed next to Sarah, knowing what she'd done, was unbearable. I couldn't bring myself to touch her, let alone look at her. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured her with him, laughing, talking, kissing, and it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I started sleeping on the couch, which only made everything feel more real. It was the first tangible step toward the separation that I knew was inevitable. Sarah didn't fight me on it. She didn't fight for much of anything, really. She apologized a few times, but they were hollow words, and I could tell she didn't fully grasp the depth of the pain she'd caused. I didn't just lose my wife, I lost my sense of security, my trust, and a part of myself. I felt like a failure, like I hadn't been good enough to keep her happy, even though I knew, logically, that her choices were her own. Still, the questions haunted me. Was I not attentive enough? Did I work too much? Was there something I could have done to stop this? I turned to running as a way to cope. I'd always been a casual jogger, but now it became a lifeline. Every morning, I'd lace up my sneakers and hit the pavement, pushing my body to its limits in an attempt to quiet my mind. The physical pain of running was a welcome distraction from the emotional agony. I also started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. At first, it felt awkward, but over time, it became a safe space to pour out everything I couldn't say out loud. The anger, the sadness, the overwhelming sense of betrayal, I wrote it all down, and somehow, it made it feel a little less heavy. I didn't talk to anyone about what was going on at first. I was too ashamed. Admitting that my wife had cheated on me felt like admitting that I'd failed as a husband. But eventually, the isolation became too much, and I confided in my best friend, Matt. I'll never forget his reaction. He didn't say much at first, just sat there, letting me talk and vent and cry. When I was done, he looked me in the eye and said, "Mark, this isn't on you. Sarah made her choices, and they're not a reflection of who you are. You're a good man, and you're a damn good dad. Don't let her make you doubt that." Those words were a lifeline. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. But even with Matt's support, the road ahead felt impossibly long. I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. I had decisions to make, about Sarah, about our marriage, about what kind of life I wanted to build for myself and my daughters. And while the thought of moving forward terrified me, the thought of staying stuck in this pain was even worse. As the days turned into weeks, I realized I couldn't keep living in this state of uncertainty. Every moment spent under the same roof as Sarah felt suffocating. I was constantly reminded of what she had done, of the lies she had told, and it was eating away at me. I had to decide what came next, not just for me, but for Emily and Katie. At first, I thought about trying to work things out. Despite the betrayal, a part of me wanted to believe that maybe we could fix it, that the life we had built together wasn't completely lost. I told myself that people make mistakes, and maybe this was one we could recover from. But every time I thought about giving her another chance, the texts would resurface in my mind, vivid and raw. The things she had said to Dan, the intimacy she had shared with him, it wasn't something I could just forgive and forget. I decided to have a serious conversation with Sarah about where we stood. One evening, after the girls were asleep, I asked her to sit down with me in the living room. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater as I gathered my thoughts. "I need to know where your head is at," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Do you even want to fix this? Or are you just waiting for me to make the decision for you? She hesitated, her eyes avoiding mine. Mark, I don't know, she admitted. I care about you. I care about the girls. But, her voice trailed off, and I knew what was coming. But you don't want to end things with him, I finished for her, my tone sharper than I intended. She looked at me then, her expression filled with guilt. It's not that simple, she said. I don't know how to just shut off my feelings for him. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Any hope I'd been holding on to that we could salvage our marriage crumbled in that moment. She wasn't willing to let him go. She wasn't willing to choose us. I nodded slowly, the reality sinking in. You've made your choice, then, I said quietly. And now I have to make mine. Over the next few days, I consulted a lawyer. I needed to know what my options were, especially when it came to custody of Emily and Katie. The attorney was blunt. Texas laws often favored mothers in custody disputes, and if I wanted to secure my rights, I'd need to be strategic. It was a hard pill to swallow, but I was determined to fight for my daughters. They were my world, and I couldn't let Sarah's choices disrupt their lives more than they already had. When I told Sarah I wanted a divorce, she didn't fight me. She seemed resigned, almost relieved, and that hurt more than I expected. I thought there would be tears, begging, some sign that she wanted to make this work. But instead, she simply nodded and said, I understand. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of relief. For the first time in weeks, I had clarity. This marriage, this life we had built, was over. But that didn't mean my life was over. I still had my daughters, my career, and the strength to rebuild. Making the decision to end my marriage was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also the first step toward taking back control of my life. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't stay in the past any longer. The decision was made, but acting on it brought a whole new wave of challenges. Once the words, I want a divorce, were spoken, the atmosphere in the house shifted completely. Everything felt heavier, like the walls themselves were holding on to the tension. The first step was creating physical space. I told Sarah she needed to move her things into the guest room. It was a small room, barely big enough for a twin bed and a dresser, but it was all we had. She didn't argue. Without a word, she began packing her belongings from our bedroom. Watching her take down her jewelry box, fold her clothes, and carry her things across the hall was surreal. This was the woman I'd shared a life with for over a decade, and now we were like strangers living under the same roof. For the girls' sake, we agreed to keep things as normal as possible, for now. Emily and Katie didn't need to see the cracks in their parents' relationship, not yet. It was hard, though, pretending everything was okay when I could barely look Sarah in the eye. Every interaction between us felt forced, transactional. The hardest part was the mornings. I'd wake up on the couch, stiff and aching, and hear the sound of Sarah moving around in the kitchen, making coffee or packing the girls' lunches. It was such a stark reminder of how things used to be, when we'd sit at the table together, laugh over breakfast, and share little moments before the chaos of the day began. Now, those moments felt like they belonged to another life. I threw myself into routines to keep my mind busy. I got up earlier, went for longer runs, and started spending more time with the girls. We'd go to the park, work on school projects, or just play board games at home. I wanted to make sure they felt loved and secure, even if my world was falling apart. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to retreat further into herself. She started staying out later, sometimes not coming home until after the girls were in bed. When I asked where she'd been, she'd give vague answers like work stuff or just needed some time to think. I didn't press her, I didn't need to. I knew exactly who she was spending her time with. One evening, while the girls were asleep, I found myself standing in the basement, surrounded by the boxes of Sarah's belongings I'd moved down there after our talk. I picked up a photo album, one of the ones we'd put together after our honeymoon. As I flipped through the pages, I was hit with a wave of nostalgia and grief. There we were, smiling on a beach in Hawaii, so full of hope and love. It felt like I was looking at strangers. That night, I sat down and made a list of everything I needed to do to move forward. It wasn't just about the logistics of divorce, splitting assets, custody arrangements, it was about taking control of my life again. I realized I couldn't just focus on what I was losing, I had to think about what I was gaining. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but it was the life I had now. And I was determined to make it better, for myself and for my daughters. As the weeks went on, Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. She seemed torn between two lives, the one she'd built with me and the girls, and the one she was chasing with Dan. On some days, she acted as though she wanted to make things work, asking me how I was feeling or suggesting we talk. On other days, she was distant, distracted, and quick to leave the house without explanation. One night, after the girls were in bed, Sarah and I found ourselves sitting in the living room together. It wasn't planned, we just happened to both be there, silently scrolling through our phones. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I couldn't take it anymore. "Do you even feel guilty?" I asked suddenly, my voice cutting through the silence. She looked up, startled. "Of course I feel guilty," she said, setting her phone down. "But guilt doesn't change how I feel, Mark." Her words stung, but I pressed on. "So, help me understand. How do you justify this? How do you look at Emily and Katie every day knowing what you've done to their family?" Sarah sighed heavily and ran a hand through her hair. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen," she said. "I didn't wake up one day and decide to hurt you or the girls. But things haven't been right between us for a long time." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. "What are you talking about?" I shot back. "We've had our ups and downs, sure, but I thought we were happy." "I thought you were happy." "I was, for a while," she admitted, her voice soft. "But then life got in the way. The stress, the routines, the feeling like we were just coexisting instead of really connecting. And then Dan came along, and he made me feel seen again." "Seen?" I repeated bitterly. "You needed another man to make you feel seen. What about everything I've done for you, for this family? Does that not count for anything?" "It's not about you, Mark," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's about me. I've felt lost for years, like I'm just going through the motions. Dan reminded me of who I used to be before everything got so heavy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Heavy?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You mean our marriage? Our kids? That's what you call heavy?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she took a deep breath and looked me in the eye. "I'm not saying it's right, okay? I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. But I can't change the way I feel. And I can't pretend that everything's fine when it's not." Her words left me reeling. On one hand, I could see that she was struggling, torn between her guilt and her desire for something she couldn't quite articulate. On the other hand, her refusal to take full responsibility for her actions only deepened the anger and betrayal I felt. After that conversation, it became clear that Sarah wasn't just dealing with the fallout of her affair, she was also grappling with her own identity and sense of purpose. She started going out even more, sometimes staying out all night. When I confronted her about it, she'd brush it off, saying she needed space to figure things out. But her quest for clarity only seemed to push her further away, from me, from the girls, and from the life we'd built together. In the end, I realized that I couldn't control Sarah's actions or her choices. All I could do was focus on protecting myself and my daughters from the chaos she was creating. After weeks of living in limbo, I realized that waiting for Sarah to make up her mind was a waste of time. She wasn't going to choose us, at least not fully, and I couldn't keep putting my life on hold, hoping for a miracle. It was time to take control of the situation and start planning for the inevitable. I made an appointment with the lawyer I'd spoken to earlier, this time with the intent of moving forward. We went over everything in detail: Texas divorce laws, custody arrangements, and what I could do to protect my rights as a father. The lawyer was clear: infidelity could play a role in the court's decisions, but I'd need to be smart about how I built my case. The first thing I did was start documenting everything. I kept a journal, recording Sarah's behavior, the nights she stayed out, and any interactions that seemed relevant. I also gathered evidence, screenshots of her text messages with Dan. Yes, I went back into her phone when she wasn't around, emails, and anything else that might support my claim. It felt cold and calculated, but I knew it was necessary. My lawyer also advised me to focus on demonstrating my role as the primary caregiver for Emily and Katie. That wasn't hard. I was already doing most of the heavy lifting when it came to parenting. I made sure to be there for every school drop-off, every soccer practice, and every bedtime story. I wanted to ensure the girls felt as secure and loved as possible, even as their mother drifted further away. Financially, I had to get my ducks in a row too. I opened a separate bank account and started diverting part of my paycheck into it. It wasn't much, just enough to ensure I had a cushion in case things got messy. I also pulled copies of all our financial records, bank statements, retirement accounts, credit card bills, so I'd have a clear picture of where we stood. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed oblivious to what I was doing. She was too wrapped up in her own world, coming and going as she pleased and offering little explanation for her behavior. At one point, she even asked me if we could stay friends through all of this, as though that would somehow make everything easier. Friends? I scoffed when she brought it up one evening. You think we can be friends after everything you've done? I just don't want things to get ugly, she said, her voice defensive. We have the girls to think about. That was the first time I truly understood how little she grasped the damage she'd caused. To her, this was just a messy chapter in her life, something to navigate and move past. But for me, it was the dismantling of everything I'd ever known. Still, I kept my composure. I didn't want to give her any reason to paint me as irrational or vengeful. Instead, I nodded and said, "We'll see how things play out." Inside, though, I was steeling myself for battle. The hardest part was keeping all of this from the girls. Emily and Katie were perceptive; they could sense the tension, even if they didn't understand the cause. Emily, the older of the two, started asking questions like, "Why doesn't Mommy eat dinner with us anymore?" and "Why do you and Mommy never sit together?" I tried my best to reassure her without lying, but it was a fine line to walk. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd sit on the couch and think about the life I was trying to rebuild. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was one I could control. I would fight for my daughters, protect what mattered most, and ensure that when the dust settled, we'd come out stronger on the other side. This wasn't the path I wanted, but it was the one I had to take. And I was determined to walk it with as much dignity and strength as I could muster. The breaking point came on a Friday evening, just a few days after Sarah had stayed out all night without even bothering to text me. I'd been holding things together for weeks, keeping my focus on Emily and Katie, but her blatant disregard for our family finally pushed me past my limit. That night, I was in the living room helping Emily with a school project when Sarah walked through the door. It was almost 9 p.m., and she didn't even try to explain why she was so late. She just set her purse down on the counter and started scrolling through her phone, as if nothing was wrong. "Seriously, Sarah?" I said, my voice tight with anger. She glanced up, startled. "What? You can't just come and go whenever you feel like it," I said, keeping my voice low so the girls wouldn't hear. "This isn't a hotel, and you're not a guest here. You're supposed to be their mother." Her face hardened. "Don't lecture me, Mark. I had a long day, and I don't need this right now." "Oh, you had a long day?" I snapped, standing up from the couch. Try being the one who actually shows up for them every single day while you're out playing whatever game it is you're playing. Don't make this about the kids, she said, her voice rising. You're just mad because I'm not sitting here wallowing in guilt like you want me to. That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. Guilt? You think I care whether you feel guilty? You destroyed our family, Sarah. You lied to me, to Emily and Katie. And now you don't even have the decency to put them first while we're figuring this out. She crossed her arms and glared at me. You don't get to act like a saint, Mark. You're not perfect, and this marriage didn't fall apart all by itself. No, it didn't, I shot back. You made sure of that the moment you decided to start sneaking around with Dan. You could have come to me. You could have told me you were unhappy. But instead, you lied, you cheated, and now you're acting like none of this is your fault. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of Emily and Katie playing in the other room. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook. You need to decide what you want, Sarah, I said, my voice quieter but no less firm. Because this limbo? It's not working. Not for me, not for the girls, and honestly, not for you either. If you're not willing to step up, then I need you to step out. For good. She looked away, her jaw clenched. So that's it, she said finally. You're just done. I didn't say that, I replied. But if you want to save anything, your relationship with me, your role as a mother, you need to show me that you care. Because right now, all I see is someone who's running away from her responsibilities. Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the floor, while I walked out of the room. That conversation was the final nail in the coffin for me. I'd held on to hope for as long as I could, but it was clear that Sarah wasn't ready, or willing, to put in the work to fix what she'd broken. From that point on, my focus shifted entirely to preparing for the divorce and making sure Emily and Katie were protected. I stopped trying to make sense of Sarah's actions and started focusing on the future, one where she'd play a much smaller role in our lives. It wasn't the resolution I'd wanted, but it was the one I needed. Filing for divorce felt surreal, like signing the end of a chapter I'd once thought would last forever. But it wasn't just the emotional weight of it all, it was the sheer magnitude of the process. Divorce isn't just about separating from a person, it's about untangling a life. The first step was serving Sarah with the papers. My lawyer advised me to do it formally, through a process server, to ensure everything was documented properly. When the server showed up at our door one afternoon, Sarah's reaction was a mix of shock and anger. Really, Mark? She snapped, holding the envelope. You couldn't have just handed these to me yourself. This isn't about making things easier for you, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. It's about doing things the right way. From that moment, the house became even more tense. Sarah started avoiding me as much as possible, retreating to the guest room or leaving the house for hours on end. I knew she was spending more time with Dan, but I'd stopped caring. My focus was on Emily and Katie, and on making sure the divorce would be as fair as possible, for me and, most importantly, for the girls. The next hurdle was custody. My lawyer had been upfront about the challenges. Texas courts tend to favor mothers, especially when young children are involved. But we had a strong case. I'd been the primary caregiver for months, handling school drop-offs, meals, and bedtime routines while Sarah checked out. And the evidence of her affair didn't hurt either. I started documenting everything even more meticulously. Every time Sarah came home late or missed an important event for the girls, I wrote it down. I took screenshots of her social media posts, photos of her out with friends or at events while she claimed to be working. It felt invasive and petty, but I knew it was necessary to protect my rights as a father. Meanwhile, Sarah hired her own lawyer. She wasn't thrilled about the divorce, but she didn't try to stop it either. Her main concern seemed to be securing enough financial support to maintain her lifestyle. One evening, she sat me down at the kitchen table, something we hadn't done in months. "I don't want to fight about money, Mark," she said. "I just want to make sure the girls are taken care of." "I agree," I replied. "But let's be honest, you're not exactly in a position to make demands right now." Her eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've been here every day, taking care of them, while you've been elsewhere," I said, choosing my words carefully. "The court is going to see that. And if you're expecting me to bankroll your nights out with Dan, you're going to be disappointed." The conversation ended with her storming out of the room, but it set the tone for the weeks that followed. Negotiations were tense, and there were moments when I wondered if we'd ever reach an agreement. But through it all, I kept reminding myself why I was doing this, for Emily and Katie. The girls were starting to ask more questions by this point. Emily, especially, was perceptive. "Why is Mommy always so tired?" she asked one night as I tucked her in. "It's been a tough time for all of us," I said gently. "But I promise, no matter what happens, you and Katie will always be loved and taken care of." Hearing those words come out of my mouth felt like a small victory. I couldn't control Sarah's choices, but I could control how I showed up for my daughters. And that gave me the strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. If I thought filing for divorce was hard, nothing prepared me for the custody battle. The fight over who would get to raise Emily and Katie wasn't just a legal process, it felt like a judgment on who was the better parent, and I was determined to win. From the beginning, my lawyer made it clear that custody battles in Texas often favor the mother. "It's going to come down to what's in the best interests of the children," she said. "And we need to prove that's you." It was a daunting task, but I was ready. I'd already been the primary caregiver for months, and my relationship with the girls was strong. Still, the process was exhausting. There were court-mandated evaluations, home visits, and endless paperwork. I had to recount every detail of my life, both the good and the bad, while trying not to let the stress show in front of the girls. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed increasingly detached. She showed up to the evaluations but barely made an effort to present herself as the stable parent. I could tell she was relying on the assumption that the court would side with her simply because she was their mother. But her behavior outside of court told a different story. She continued staying out late, sometimes not coming home at all, and the girls were starting to notice. Emily would ask why Mommy wasn't there for bedtime, and Katie would cling to me, clearly unsettled by the changes in our home. I documented everything, every missed dinner, every late-night outing, every excuse she gave me when I asked where she'd been. When it came time to present our cases in court, my lawyer laid everything out clearly and methodically. She showed the judge my journal, the screenshots of Sarah's social media posts, and a detailed log of how I'd been caring for the girls while Sarah was absent. She argued that I provided stability and consistency, two things the girls desperately needed during this tumultuous time. Sarah's lawyer tried to paint a different picture, emphasizing that she was still their mother and that the girls needed her in their lives. But the evidence against her was hard to ignore. The affair, the late nights, the lack of involvement, it all added up to a narrative that didn't favor her. The property division was another headache entirely. Sarah wanted to keep the house, arguing that it was the girls' home and that uprooting them would be unfair. But I couldn't afford to let her have it, especially since I was fighting for primary custody. If I won, the girls would need a stable home with me, and I wasn't about to sacrifice that for her convenience. After weeks of back-and-forth negotiations, we finally reached a settlement. I would keep the house, and Sarah would move out. She'd get a modest share of our savings, along with some of the furniture, but I retained the majority of our assets. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a fair one. When the judge finally ruled on custody, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was granted primary custody of Emily and Katie, with Sarah getting visitation rights. The court recognized that I was the more stable parent, and while I wished it hadn't come to this, I was grateful that the system had worked in my favor. That evening, as I tucked the girls into bed in what was now officially our home, I felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The battle wasn't over. Co-parenting with Sarah was going to be its own challenge, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could see a future where the girls and I would be okay. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to rebuild. After the court's decision, life didn't magically go back to normal, but it finally felt like I could start moving forward. Having primary custody of Emily and Katie brought both relief and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. I wasn't just their dad anymore, I was their anchor, their safe place, and the one who would guide them through the aftermath of this upheaval. Sarah moved out a week after the ruling. Watching her pack up her things and leave the house was bittersweet. Part of me still mourned the life we had shared, the dreams we'd built together, and the future I thought we were heading toward. But there was also a sense of finality, like the chapter of our marriage was finally closed. The girls struggled with the changes at first. Emily, being older, understood more than I realized. She asked tough questions, like, "Why can't mommy live here with us?" and, "Did you and mommy stop loving each other?" Answering her wasn't easy, but I made a promise to myself to always be honest, age appropriately, of course. Sometimes, grown-ups make choices that hurt each other, I told her one night as we sat on her bed. But I'll always love you and Katie. And no matter what happens, we'll always be a family, even if things look a little different now. Katie, on the other hand, just wanted reassurance. She clung to me more than ever, constantly asking if I was going to leave too. It broke my heart, but I made sure to remind her every day that I wasn't going anywhere. Co-parenting with Sarah was rocky from the start. She had visitation every other weekend and one evening during the week, but she struggled to stick to the schedule. Sometimes she'd cancel last minute, claiming she had work obligations or wasn't feeling well. Other times, she'd show up late, leaving the girls waiting by the door. I tried to stay patient, reminding myself that the girls needed their mom in their lives, even if she wasn't always consistent. But it was hard not to feel frustrated, especially when I saw how her behavior affected them. Emily would get upset when Sarah canceled plans, and Katie would cry when she didn't show up on time. One evening, after Sarah missed another scheduled visit, Emily asked, "Why doesn't mommy want to see us?" "She does, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. "She's just figuring things out right now. But I promise, I'm always here for you, no matter what." Despite the challenges, I started to see glimmers of hope in our new life. The girls and I fell into a routine, one that felt stable and predictable. We had dinner together every night, read stories before bed, and spent weekends exploring parks, watching movies, or just enjoying each other's company. I also started taking care of myself again. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost in the chaos of the past year. Running became my therapy, and I even joined a local group of dads who met every Saturday morning for trail runs. They were a mix of single dads, divorced dads, and married dads, and sharing our stories gave me a sense of camaraderie I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about moving forward, though. It was about building something new, something better. I stopped measuring my happiness against the life I'd lost and started focusing on the one I was creating. And while it wasn't perfect, it was ours. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table laughing at Katie's attempt to tell a knock-knock joke, I realized that I hadn't thought about the past in hours. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. This was our life now. And it was a good one. I wasn't looking for anyone new. After everything I'd been through with Sarah, the idea of dating felt impossible. I was focused on my daughters, my career, and piecing my life back together. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. I met Diane at a community event the girls and I attended one Saturday. It was a local park cleanup organized by the city, and I'd signed up as a way to teach Emily and Katie the importance of giving back. Diane was one of the event coordinators, running around with a clipboard and a contagious energy that made even picking up trash seem like fun. She noticed the girls first, complimenting Emily on how carefully she was sorting recyclables and making Katie laugh with a silly joke about worms. When she turned to me, she flashed a warm smile. "You've got some pretty awesome helpers here," she said. "Thanks," I replied, smiling back. "They're the brains of the operation. I'm just here for the heavy lifting." Diane chuckled, and we ended up chatting for a bit while the kids ran off to play. She told me about her work with the Parks Department and her love of outdoor activities. I told her about Emily and Katie, carefully avoiding any mention of my messy divorce. I wasn't ready to open up about that yet. By the end of the day, Diane had somehow roped me into signing up for another volunteer event the following month. "It's for a good cause," she said with a wink. "Plus, I think your girls would love it." Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about her more than I expected. She wasn't just beautiful, she was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. There was something about her that felt different. Like she wasn't trying to impress anyone, she was just herself. When we saw each other again at the next event, Diane greeted me like an old friend. This time, we talked a little longer, and she asked more about my life. I hesitated at first, but eventually, I told her the truth, that I was divorced and raising 2 daughters on my own. To my surprise, she didn't look uncomfortable or try to change the subject. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully and said, "That must be a lot to handle. But from what I've seen, you're doing an amazing job." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to hearing that. Most days, I felt like I was barely holding it together, but Diane made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. We exchanged numbers that day, and over the next few weeks, we started texting. It was casual at first, sharing jokes, talking about the kids, and making plans for future events. But slowly, those conversations began to feel like something more. The first time I asked Diane out, I was so nervous I almost backed out. I hadn't been on a date in over a decade, and the thought of putting myself out there again was terrifying. But Diane's smile when she said yes made it all worth it. Our first date was simple, dinner at a small Italian restaurant followed by a walk along the river. We talked about everything, from her love of hiking to my struggles as a single dad. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't carrying the weight of my past. With Diane, I could just be myself. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship grew. Diane wasn't just good with me, she was amazing with Emily and Katie. She never tried to replace Sarah but found her own special connection with the girls. Emily loved talking to her about books, and Katie adored Diane's goofy sense of humor. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a partner, not someone who took me for granted but someone who truly cared about me and my family. Diane reminded me that love didn't have to be painful or complicated. It could be simple, honest, and real. While I knew it wouldn't erase the scars of the past, being with Diane gave me hope for the future. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where life would take us. While my life began to stabilize with Diane and the girls, Sarah's life seemed to spiral further out of control. At first, I didn't pay much attention to what she was doing, I was too focused on moving forward, but it became impossible to ignore when her choices started affecting the girls. After the divorce, Sarah moved into a small apartment across town. She still had visitation rights, but her unreliability only grew worse. She'd cancel plans with little to no notice, leaving Emily and Katie disappointed and confused. On the weekends she did take them, they'd come back home tired and withdrawn, hinting at chaotic or disorganized visits. Emily, who was old enough to sense when something wasn't right, began opening up to me about her time with Sarah. "Mom seems sad a lot," she said one evening, her voice hesitant. "She doesn't play with us much, and she's always on her phone." Hearing that hurt, but it didn't surprise me. Sarah's affair with Dan hadn't exactly blossomed into the fairy tale she might have imagined. Word eventually got back to me through mutual acquaintances that their relationship had ended a few months after our divorce was finalized. Apparently, Dan wasn't interested in settling down with a divorced woman who had 2 young kids. Without Dan or the stability of our family, Sarah seemed adrift. She started bouncing between jobs, struggling to maintain the same lifestyle she had before. Social media painted a picture of nights out and superficial smiles, but behind the scenes, she was clearly struggling to find her footing. One weekend, after she missed another visitation, I decided it was time to have a serious conversation with her. I didn't want to fight, I just wanted her to understand how her actions were impacting the girls. When I showed up at her apartment, the sight of her shocked me. She looked tired, her usually well-kept appearance disheveled, and her apartment was cluttered with takeout containers and laundry. "What's going on, Sarah?" I asked gently. "You've been missing visits, and the girls are starting to notice." She sighed, sitting down on the couch and burying her face in her hands. "I know, Mark," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm trying. I really am. But everything's just falling apart." I sat across from her, torn between frustration and pity. This was the woman who had once been so full of confidence, the woman I had loved, and now she was a shadow of herself. "You need to pull it together, Sarah," I said, keeping my tone firm but not harsh. "The girls need you. They deserve better than this." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she nodded. "I know," she whispered. "I just don't know how to fix it. I made so many mistakes, and now it feels like I've lost everything." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to kick her while she was down, but I also couldn't let her wallow in self-pity. "You can't change the past," I said finally. "But you can still show up for them now. Start small. Be there when you say you'll be there. Show them that they can count on you." Sarah nodded again, wiping her eyes. "I'll try," she said, though there was a hollowness in her voice that made me doubt whether she really meant it. Over the next few months, she made some effort to improve. She showed up for more visits and even tried to attend some of the girls' school events. But her inconsistency lingered, and I could see the toll it was taking on Emily and Katie. As much as I wanted Sarah to step up, I couldn't force her to change. All I could do was be there for my daughters and give them the stability and love they needed. Sarah's struggles were a painful reminder of how choices ripple through life, not just for the person making them but for everyone around them. And while I wished things had turned out differently, I knew that I couldn't save her. That was something she'd have to do for herself. Looking back on everything that happened, it's hard to believe how far I've come. There were moments when I thought I'd never recover, that the betrayal and the pain would swallow me whole. But here I am, standing on the other side, stronger and more certain of who I am and what matters most. The divorce, as devastating as it was, taught me lessons I didn't know I needed to learn. I learned how to prioritize my own well-being, how to advocate for myself, and how to find strength in the love I have for my daughters. Emily and Katie became my anchor through it all. They reminded me every day that no matter how broken I felt, I had a reason to keep going, to keep fighting for a better future. Diane has been a blessing in ways I never expected. She stepped into my life at a time when I wasn't sure I could open my heart again, and she showed me what a healthy, supportive relationship looks like. She didn't just love me, she embraced Emily and Katie as part of her life, too. Watching her connect with them has been one of the greatest joys of this new chapter. Sarah's journey has been harder. While I still hope she finds the strength to turn things around, I've let go of the responsibility I once felt to fix things for her. That's her path to walk, not mine. And while her relationship with the girls remains complicated, I make it a point to ensure they know they are deeply loved and supported, no matter what. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that resilience doesn't mean never falling, it means getting back up, even when it feels impossible. It means choosing hope over bitterness, love over anger, and growth over stagnation. To anyone who might be reading this and going through something similar, here's what I'd say: you are stronger than you think. The pain feels unbearable now, but it won't last forever. Focus on what matters most, take it one day at a time, and don't be afraid to lean on the people who care about you. You can't change the past, but you can build a future worth looking forward to. As for me, I'm still a work in progress, but I finally feel at peace with where I am. Life isn't perfect, and it never will be, but it's good. It's real. And for that, I'm grateful.